Okay. Okay, everybody. We're going live. We are live, actually. I pressed live, and now it's live, so it's kind of... Hi, everybody at home. Even though there's nobody currently watching, that's fine. Great. So now we're going to be hearing from Sarah momentarily.
Is it working?
I sent an email to him.
Oh, yeah.
Do you wanna,
Oh,
you
I
can
can
make a
just- yeah.
slide and then.
Yeah. So I it's for philosophy, right? This one.
Yeah.
Oops.
Or whatever you Vanessa.
Oh, I see you found my Gmail.
Yeah,
Pardon?
that's not you, so wrap up by 12:30.
Oh, yeah. I have my time.
I'll do
Okay.
it 5, I'll do it 10, then do it 5.
Okay.
Sorry, Jack.
No. You're fine.
We started late.
That's
Yeah, it's the
that's
rosary.
that's
And the
unusual.
rosary. Great.
Yeah, it's the one thing about the kids left the room, they're good kids and everything, little
Yeah.
kids, they left the room like, dumb, like.
Okay, welcome back.
Yeah.
So we are live. Everything we say is now on YouTube. How do I get it on the screen?
Yeah, sure. This one and this one too.
Vanessa, how do we reflect it on the screen?
Just press this.
This is pretty funny.
Just do this.
Perfect.
The pointer's the thing in the middle. If you want to point this on the screen.
This is cool. I wish I had this in my classrooms.
Oh, I bought this like for like the first time I had to give a lecture. I was like, I need a pointer.
No, that's good.
Especially because I was like I was in like a bigger lecture hall.
Uh-huh.
You couldn't see anything. So
Okay, whenever you're ready. Okay. Hi, so thank you for coming out to this talk. So why am I giving this talk? It was supposed to be Father Peter, whose background was in neuroscience as well. He finished his doctorate in neuroscience and then became a priest. I actually got to hear him present on this topic, and so I'm here to take over for him. It is not totally unrelated that I'm here. I did do my background I did my undergrad in science. I did a major in general biology and a minor in chemistry. And now I'm going to be a high school teacher this coming June, for those of you who don't know me, with my teaching specializations in biology and chemistry and general science for grades 7 to 12. Right now I'm currently teaching in schools for my last practicum, and I do actually get to teach grade 11 biology. And so this is an actual, a very important topic that comes up in my class and in my day-to-day interactions with students. So I chose to present on science, philosophy, and faith, and we're going to go through a 3-story mountain to show how you can go from science and philosophy and faith and how they all relate to each other. So what is the goal of Catholic education? I think there are many goals. But one of the most important ones is to give students a framework to understand truth, to understand reality. And so someone who is truly educated, a Catholic especially, who is truly educated, is able to take all the different kinds of knowledge that they have, and they can integrate them together, and they understand them in their proper balance and perspective. It is very dangerous when we know things, but we don't understand them in their totality. And so that is something that I myself have had to grapple with, and our students do too. And I think that is why we get so many issues of why science and faith seem so incompatible, because we take one strand of knowledge and we aren't able to see it in its proper context. And so we need to challenge those false narratives that makes us choose between reason and faith, or science and faith. And we need all of these because they are all vital to our well-being and ultimately for our souls. Our ultimate purpose is heaven, and we need to know how our different strands of knowledge will get us there. So we're first going to begin with science and what the nature of science is. So in science, there's not one specific scientific method, but the scientific method essentially deals with first observation, experimentation. You would then go on to formulate a theory, and you need openness. So these are all ingredients of what constitutes the method of doing science. You would also be, if you are a scientist in the way that is spoken of now, you would be publicizing your data, your methods, and your results, and you would be opening them to peer review. So what does observation constitute? So observation first relies on our five senses. In principle, our five senses could be thought of as a first principle of knowledge. And so our five senses deal with hearing, taste, touch, and smelling in the physical world. We also, for those who are doing science, there are many things that we can't directly access with our five senses, and that is why we need instruments. So things that extend our senses, such as microscopes, telescopes, microphones, antennas. For much of history before these instruments existed, some people might not have known that bacteria exists, which has led to many deaths in the medical field. So when it comes to the nature of science, we like to ask scientific questions. And when we ask a scientific question, we are limiting the scope of our question to the observable world. And that is why when you ask a scientific question, it is never appropriate to say God as an answer. Does this mean that God isn't the answer? Of course not. But in the limited scope of when a question is properly scientific, it can be an abuse to say that God is the answer, because God is really the answer to everything. And so when you're asking a scientific question, you're asking it in a very limited sense. And so because we consider knowledge in the scientific realm true knowledge, it is an unfair answer to say God without any disclaimer. And so the triumphs of science are actually real, and scientists should be honored for their discoveries. So when you go through the study of science, you can compare it to the journey of climbing up a big mountain. And so every analogy that you'll encounter to help explain reality will always be limited. But this analogy might make sense of how science is supposed to help us bring us to the truth. And so sciences are useful because if you imagine a mountain, you can consider the base and then the apex. And so scientists are useful in bringing us to the truth, and they bring us to that base of the mountain. They allow us to examine things more closely, and they bring us closer to the truth, especially in a way that is closer than our eyes can directly see. But science itself has its limits, and that is why, as a scientist, the science has to appeal to a higher science, and that higher science we call philosophy. So the quest of philosophy is to see how far our natural power of reason can take us. So the object of philosophy, the end, the goal of philosophy, is the kind of truth that we can attain just by relying on our own reasoning powers, the ability to think about thinking. So methods of philosophy all depend upon making logical inferences, so reasoning from a premise or a statement to a conclusion. But we can't make the mistake of reducing philosophy just to pure logic, but we can never remove logic from the equation. Otherwise, we would not have philosophy. So the ability just to even make a distinction between science and philosophy is me doing philosophy right before your very eyes. So there's actually a whole field dedicated to studying science from a philosophical lens. We would call it the philosophy of science. And that is what the methods of science must appeal to. Otherwise, we would just be doing things and observing things. But some scientists, some philosophers of science, claim that the only thing that is true, to their own faults, is scientific knowledge. But if that is the claim, if the claim that only scientific knowledge is true knowledge, then their statement must also be scientifically proven. But the thing is, the claim that only scientific knowledge is a philosophical claim because you cannot prove it or demonstrate it by doing an experiment. So we would call this self-referentially inconsistent. It's a self-contradicting statement. So it is folly, essentially. So it is an opinion. So but the thing is with philosophy extends beyond science, as I've said it. Science must appeal to something higher, and that is philosophy. But philosophy also has its limits. It brings us up closer to the mountain of truth, and we could say it brings us to the crest of the mountain. This doesn't mean that every philosophy or every philosophical system is true. Some philosophies are plain wrong, and even the best of us, such as St. Augustine, can be led down false philosophical truths, such as before his conversion when he believed in the irrational Manichaean philosophy to be true. So, contrary to what many people think, the Catholic Church completely supports and encourages our use of reason. So, the Catholic Church affirms that the human mind can come to know, just through the study of nature alone, that there is a transcendent being, a creator. In fact, in Scripture, I'm going to mess up the verse, but it essentially says that anyone who denies the existence of a God is without excuse, because we can know that he exists just by looking at creation. A child can know that God exists without needing to read a book on philosophy, without needing to read any philosophical book. It is self-evident. Doesn't mean it's easy to come to, not necessarily, but we can know that he exists just by looking at creation. But does this tell us who God is? No. So philosophy brings us higher up the mountain, and while the church does hold reason in extremely high regard, the thing is that reason is also limited. It can only lead us closer to God. St. Thomas Aquinas would say that the use of philosophy or apologetics can remove barriers to the non-believer, but it can never bring us into intimacy with God. It itself alone is limited, and it doesn't tell us the nature of all truth. And the thing is, the ultimate goal of our lives is to be in intimacy with God, to know him, to love him, and to serve him. But the thing is that original sin, through the sin of Adam and Eve, even though we are baptized and remitted of that stain on our souls, we still inherited those consequences. And those consequences include the fact that we see and we understand things dimly, where we have a darkening of our intellect. Our minds and our hearts do not see everything clearly. And so we need a guide, and that guide is Christ in the church. So this leads us to faith. The object of our faith, of Catholic Christianity, is God. And so who is God? Well, we know that God, including the philosophers, acknowledge that he is pure spirit. He is outside of time. We know just through the Big Bang Theory, if any physicist wants to correct me, that time and space came into being at the beginning of creation. It didn't exist prior to it. And we believe that God exists in time, but outside of time as well, that he was not caused by anything, but that he is an uncaused being and the cause of all events. His power and his goodness are infinite in every single respect. Therefore, we know that God is present everywhere, so he's omnipresent. He knows everything, omniscient, and he possesses all power, omnipotent. And we cannot observe God for this very reason. If something is not observable or measurable, then in order for something to be observable and measurable, it must exist within time and space. But God isn't contained within time and space. He's not matter or energy. And so the methods of science are useless because they rely on observing and measuring things that are within a time-space continuum. So you can't use science to deny or affirm God's existence. And this is key to dealing with students, especially if you don't have a scientific background. Instead of going through every single detail of science, you don't need to know that. You first have to bring the student to first understand this, that God isn't You can't know God through the scientific method. He can lead you to God, it can lead you to God, but it can't disprove or prove his existence. And so that is why we need God to reveal himself to us. So he's allowed us to discover many things through the natural law, through reason, but there's some things in which he chose to reveal to ourselves. And unless God reveals himself to us, we cannot know him as he knows himself. So that is why we need the church, and we need revealed religion. And God chose the Catholic Church as that institution, as that mystical body in which he would reveal the truths which our reason alone can't bring us to, which philosophy can't bring us to, which science can't bring us to. And it gives us the answers that we all in our hearts are searching for. So the study of theology is the study of God. It is the study of divine revelation, what God has revealed to us. And theology leads us to that very top of the mountain. Does it tell us everything about God? No, that is reserved for heaven alone and the beatific vision. But in theology, we know that God has revealed things to us through the church, and we can study these things. And it leads us to the top of that mountain, where we can see the vastness of the Heavenly Father's creation and our role within the divine plan to unite all things in him, things in the heaven and things on the earth under Christ. So good theology allows us to see the connection between all things, visible and invisible, and the ultimate end for their existence. And so we're just going to have another short, small group discussion. But before we begin that, does anyone have a question about the talk? No? Okay. So we're just going to go through two questions which Jeff developed. And so I'll read the first and second one, and then we can separate into new groups this time. So the first question would be, sometimes scientists are suspicious of philosophy. So St. John Paul II outlined requirements that theology makes for philosophy in his encyclical Faith and Reason. Science also has some requirements for philosophy. So what are some of the ways that philosophy could be incompatible with science? So we can look at this question historically through the lens of the divide between the two cultures of science and the humanities. And then second, in many global indigenous cultures, there is a natural belief in one God, in contrast to polytheism. So belief in God can exist amidst the use of the most recent technology and scientific knowledge. So have you ever had students from these cultures in your classroom? And why do you think it is so easy for them to believe in God? So consider the relationship of family and early childhood education and their relationship to nature. So if you can just get into groups, and we'll continue the discussion.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're